Well, first of all, thanks for these two kind words from both Clemens and Klaus. I'm both humbled and slightly embarrassed about the kindness and generosity of your words. Klaus asked the question, how did I, arrive here where I am today? And I think one key thing are the people you meet who support you and affect you positively in different ways. And I think it's extremely appropriate that Klaus is giving this laudation, because there's no way I would be here today without the positive externalities that I've benefited from through my work with Klaus. As Klaus said, we go way back. Klaus was my teacher before grad school, and then we started working together, and I've learned a ton from Klaus, and we did a lot of things together early on, including a pivotal visit to Berkeley in 2003, where we met and started working with Emmanuel Saez, another person who has been very important for sort of the trajectory of both Klaus and myself. So thank you, Klaus, for all the positive externalities that you've provided over the years and still do. I guess it's time to start the lecture. So today I'm going to present on a topic that I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about and working on over the last few years. The specific project that I'm going to talk about today, the Child Penalty Atlas, is the result of joint work with two researchers at the LSE, Camille Landais and Gabriel Leite-Mariante. This specific project is really the culmination of a research program I started with Camille about 8 or 10 years ago. So in this paper, we're interested in trying to achieve a better understanding of the variation in gender inequality and labor market outcomes across countries, as well as over time. We are particularly interested in understanding the role of so-called child penalties, and by child penalties I mean the effects of parenthood on the outcomes of women relative to men. A recent literature has shown that child penalties account for almost all of the remaining gender inequality and labor market outcomes, at least in the high-income countries where we have evidence. In other words, for these high-income countries, eliminating gender inequality and labor market outcomes is virtually synonymous with eliminating child penalties. Now, that's a fairly big statement, and it raises the question, how general are these insights from this literature? That is, how does child penalty vary both across time and across space? What are the underlying drivers of this variation? Now, the issue is that we currently don't have great answers to these questions, and that has to do with a set of methodological and data limitations in this literature, specifically the fact that the event study approach we typically use to estimate child penalties require extensive panel data, which are only available for a small subset of high-income countries. So we really only have good evidence from a very small and sort of relatively homogeneous set of countries. Okay, so the idea of this project is to address these limitations by building a global atlas of child penalties. Okay, so to be able to do this, we make two innovations. In terms of methodology, we adopt a pseudo-event study approach that I developed in a recent paper. The key advantage of this approach is that it allows for conducting event studies around childbirth using only cross-sectional data. This greatly expands the set of countries that we can analyze. In terms of data, we gather and harmonize microdata on children and labor market outcome for 134 different countries around the world. Okay? This allows us to document the variation in child penalties over many different countries as well as over time. As you will see, child penalties exist everywhere, or almost everywhere, but they vary enormously in magnitude. I'll show you that there is enormous variation both across countries at different development levels as well as conditional on the level of development. Okay, so to be able to do this, we combine different data sources. We use census data, household surveys, labor force surveys, as well as administrative records from across different countries. Okay. Our total data set includes about 300 million observations that are representative of about 7.3 billion people, or 95.5% of the global population. Okay. For the vast majority of countries, we will use cross-sectional data from different sources. This includes both international data sources that have already been harmonized across countries and over time, as well as a number of country-specific sources that we have gathered over the last few years. For a few countries, we will use panel data, mostly administrative data covering the full population of those countries. Those are exactly some of the countries we've studied in prior papers, such as the Scandinavian countries and Austria and Switzerland. Okay. The map here illustrates the sort of extensive global coverage of our data. Different colors represent different data sources. The countries in gray are those countries for which we don't yet have data. These are primarily countries in Central Asia, some countries in the Middle East, and some countries in North Africa, plus Greenland. Now, a good thing is that the countries that we don't have are generally not very populous, so in terms of the population covered, we cover most people in the world. Okay, so to set the scene, let's start with documenting the variation in raw gender gaps in different countries around the world, and I'm going to focus, and in this paper we do focus on gender gaps in employment rates. This slide here shows a heat map of gender gaps in employment. Countries have been divided into deciles of the gender gap, with darker colors representing larger gaps. Okay. As you can see, there is a lot of variation in the degree of gender inequality. The gender gap varies from about 5% in the most equal societies in the world to about 90% in the most unequal societies of the world. Gender gaps are generally low in high-income countries in North America, Europe, and Australia. Gender gaps are also relatively low in Central Africa. Conversely, gender gaps are high in Latin America, North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. One thing that you can kind of see in a heat map of this type is that there is a relationship between gender inequality and the level of development or GDP per capita. Kind of see that looks like gender inequality is relatively small at high levels of development as well as at low levels of development, while it is relatively high at intermediate levels of development, such as in Latin America, North Africa, or the Middle East. To make this clear, let me show you a scatter plot of employment gaps against GDP per capita. Okay, so this graph here shows the raw scatter of employment gaps against GDP per capita. Those are the gray and black dots. It shows a bin scatter version of that. Those are the pink diamonds. And finally, it shows a polynomial fit in the form of the blue line. And so what you can see here is that there is this inverse U relationship between gender inequality and GDP per capita. It is low at the lowest income levels, such as in Central Africa. It is low in very high income countries, and it is generally very large at intermediate levels of GDP per capita. Interestingly, this is sort of reminiscent of a Kuznets curve. But of course here a Kuznets curve in gender inequality rather than a Kuznets curve in income inequality that was the focus of the work of Kuznets. So, one key objective of this project is to understand the degree to which child penalties can explain this evolution of gender inequality across levels of development. Okay. Now, before showing you results, let me take a few minutes to just sort of describe the methodology that we use in this paper, in particular this pseudo-event study approach. Okay. All right, so the way we're going to estimate child penalties here, and the way we've estimated in previous papers, is via a set of event studies of first childbirth. We normally do this using panel data. We don't have panel data for most of the countries here. So a first step is to convert our cross-sectional data into a pseudo-panel data set around childbirth. To see the main issue or the main challenge in doing that, let's denote event time relative to first childbirth by T. Okay, so for those observed with children in the cross-sectional data, we know their location in positive event time. That's the age of their oldest child. For those observed without children in the cross-sectional data, we do not know their location in negative event time. That is, we don't know if and when they will have children. The general idea of our approach is to create a synthetic population of future parents who are very similar to observed parents. Okay? Specifically, here's what we do. Consider a parent observed at event time 0, so the year immediately after childbirth, in calendar year Y, and with age A and a set of demographic characteristics X. To create a synthetic future parent for this parent, we will match this person to non-parents who were observed n years prior, when they were n years younger, and with the same characteristics X. And that's going to give us an observation for event time minus n. Okay? By repeating this procedure for different n's, we create a pseudo-panel in event time t, including observations of both negative and positive event times. Okay? The set of x variables we use in this matching procedure is relatively light and includes variables that we observe consistently across all 134 countries. In the data, we match on gender, marital status, education categories, and a dummy for urban versus rural residents. Okay. Once we have this pseudo panel, then we can run an event study along the lines of what we've done in previous papers. So this is the event study specification. We regress an outcome on a set of event time dummies, omitting a base year prior to childbirth, as well as a full set of age and year dummies, that is age and calendar year dummies. The idea of the age and year dummies is to absorb the effect of life cycle trends and time trends unrelated to having children. Okay. The coefficient alpha GT from this specification here is the impact of childbirth on gender G at event time T. Okay. We will focus on employment throughout this project. Employment is an important labor market outcome, and importantly, it's the one that we're able to observe consistently across all of the 134 countries in our data. Okay. The event study specification is going to give us the effect on employment rates in absolute terms. We convert that into effects in percentage terms by scaling with the baseline level or the counterfactual level of employment without children. And then the child penalty is defined as the average difference between the impacts on men and women across all positive event times. Okay, this number, if this number is positive, that means that childbirth, parenthood contributes positively to gender gaps. Okay, now, before showing you results for all of the different countries in our data, I'd like to first convince you that this approach, actually this pseudo-event study approach, is valid. So we can validate this approach for a subset of countries in the data where we have access to both cross-sectional and panel data. Okay. So let's compare the pseudo-event studies against actual event studies using panel data and see if they give roughly similar results. As you can probably guess, given I'm standing here today talking about it, it works. Okay, so I'll give you a few examples. This slide here shows you 4 case studies: Austria, Chile, Denmark, and Japan. A nice feature of the validation here is that we're considering countries that differ substantially in terms of their income levels, their institutional context, the continent on which they're located, and so on. Each panel here shows pseudo-event studies as well as actual event studies around first childbirth, depicted by the red vertical line. Women are shown in black, men are shown in gray. The pseudo-event studies are shown in solid lines. The actual event studies are shown in dashed lines. The key insight from these graphs is that in all of the countries shown, the 2 approaches give virtually identical results. The event study series track each other very closely over time. Of course, the general insight from both of the approaches here, and we're going to come back to that later, is that having children is a non-event for men, while it leads to sharp and persistent impacts on the employment of women. That's true in all of these different countries, although to different degrees, as we'll come back to. The bottom line here is that the 2 approaches give the same answer. Okay? We're able to do validations of this sort for 11 countries out of the 134. This graph here shows a scatter of the pseudo-event study child penalties against the actual event study child penalties. And you can see for all 11 countries where we're able to do this, the dots lie very close to the 45-degree line. The R squared from a regression of pseudo-event study child penalties and actual event study child penalties is about 0.96. Okay. So based on this validation, we're going to run with this approach and try and document child penalties across the world. Okay. So we are now ready to go on a trip together and visit child penalties around the world. I'll show you a set of event studies from different countries. I'll then put everything together in a set of maps. And then I'll turn to a set of analysis intended to shed light on what's really going underneath these patterns that we see. Okay, so let's start with a bird's eye view looking at child penalties at the level of continents. So this slide here shows event studies of first childbirth across 6 continents. As you can see, there's quite a bit of variation. Qualitatively, the event studies look similar in all continents, right? Men and women follow parallel trends prior to childbirth, but diverge immediately, sharply after childbirth. Parenthood is a non-event for men, as I already said, based on 4 specific countries, while it leads to these sharp and persistent drops for women. So qualitatively, these event studies are very similar and very clear in all continents, but the magnitude of the child penalty is quite different. Latin America featured the highest child penalties observed anywhere in the world, at least on average, a child penalty of about 38% on that continent. Africa featured the lowest child penalties observed in the world, an average child penalty of about 9%. The high-income continents of North America, Europe, and Oceania are somewhere in the middle, child penalties of between 25 and 30%. Okay. So there's quite a lot of heterogeneity here across countries, across continents, but these continent-level graphs actually mask a tremendous amount of heterogeneity across countries within continents. And I'm now going to give you some examples of that, and I'm going to organize the presentation here by continent. Okay, so let's start with Europe. Okay, so these are child penalties in 6 specific European countries. Again, qualitatively, the event studies are relatively similar. All of them show very clear effects of parenthood on women relative to men. Okay, but the size of the effect is very different across countries. I should say that in this slide, as well as the subsequent ones, I sequenced the event studies in terms of the size of the child penalty, so that's perhaps helpful for you to know when looking at the slide. So let's look at the 2 outliers to get a sense of the variation: Denmark and the Czech Republic. In Denmark, the child penalty on employment is about 14%. In the Czech Republic, the child penalty in employment is about 50%. So roughly 3.5 times larger than in Denmark. That's an incredible difference, and it's one that's representative of a more general pattern, namely that child penalties are relatively modest in Scandinavian countries, but very large in Central European countries, including Germany, which is also on the slide, Austria, Switzerland, Poland, and so on. Another quite striking difference in this slide is between Portugal and Spain, as you can see here. So these are 2 southern European countries located in close proximity, but the child penalties in those 2 countries is very different, about 15% in Portugal, 38% in Spain. Consistent with that, the size of the raw gender gap in these 2 countries is very different. There is just a lot more gender inequality in Spain than there is in Portugal. So that's Europe. Turning to Asia, the variation is even more dramatic there. Okay, so for example, there is virtually no child penalty in Vietnam. The child penalty is 1%. Not that far from Vietnam, we have Bangladesh, where the child penalty is 62%. And it's a staggering difference. In China, the child penalty is 4%, another country with a modest child penalty. Child penalties are very large in Japan. In Middle Eastern countries, Iran is an example I provided here on this slide. So overall, when you look, so Asia is the continent where the degree of heterogeneity is the largest. It's also the country where you see the largest child penalties anywhere in the world. The large child penalties in Asia are found in general in the Middle East, in South Asia, and in Japan and South Korea. But then at the same time, you have really low child penalties, especially in Southeast Asia, such as Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and so on. Going from Asia to Latin America stands out in the other way. It's the continent where there's the least amount of heterogeneity. Basically, in Latin America, apart from a few Caribbean countries, such as Haiti and Cuba, that I've included on this slide, child penalties are just large everywhere in Latin America. This includes all of the major Latin American countries, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Chile, that I've shown here. The child penalties in Latin American countries tend to be between 35 and 45%. So very large effects. The final continent I want to highlight here is Africa. Africa also has a lot of heterogeneity, and very interesting heterogeneity. In Africa, there's a very clear regional divide. Essentially, child penalties are very large in the northern part of Africa and in the southern part of Africa, while they're small or zero in the middle. So, as examples here, you can see that child penalties are zero in Mozambique and Tanzania. They're not zero, but extremely small in Kenya and Ghana, but they're sizable in South Africa and Morocco. Again, here you sense that there is some relationship between the size of child penalties and income levels. Obviously, income levels are smaller in Central Africa than in Northern and Southern Africa. Okay, so now these are a set of examples. Now let's put these event study estimates from all 134 countries in the data. I don't have the time today, or it would get a little tedious for me to show you all 134 countries. A better way of illustrating all of the variation is to put together everything in a map. So let me do that. So this here is a heat map of child penalties around the world. Again, countries have been divided into deciles with darker colors representing larger child penalties. Okay. This graph here illustrates some of the points I've made. This includes the consistently large child penalties in Latin America, the large child penalties in Northern Africa, the Middle East, and it also illustrates very clearly the great amount of heterogeneity in Europe and the great amount of heterogeneity in Asia, as well as the modest child penalties in all of Central Africa. Of all the variation in child penalties across the globe goes from no penalty at all to a child penalty of 64%. And again, remember the outcome here is employment. So 64% unemployment it's a very sizable effect. Okay. Now, how much of the observed gender inequality do these child penalties explain? There is a simple translation between the child penalties we have estimated and the fraction of the gender gap that they explain. Okay, so let's look at the fraction explained in a heat map. Okay, so the formula that gives the mapping between child penalties and the fraction of the gender gap explained is provided at the bottom of this figure. The map then shows the heat map of the fraction explained. One thing that's interesting is that when going from child penalties to the fraction explained, was that a good thing? I get a thing. This is better for me. Maybe it's not better for you. So one thing that's interesting is when going from child penalties to the fraction explained by child penalties, much of the within continent heterogeneity goes away. Things look a lot less heterogeneous in this map within continents than they did in the previous map. That has to do with the fact that child penalties and raw gender gaps are correlated. Where child penalties are large, the raw gender gap tends to be large, and so the fraction of child penalties explained tend to be much more uniform. Okay. In general, there's a very, I think, striking relationship here, which is that the fraction explained by child penalties of gender inequality is incredibly large in all high-income countries, North America, Europe, and Australia. The fraction explained is at least 2/3 in these countries and all the way up to 100%. Okay. Conversely, the fraction explained by child penalties is pretty modest in Central Africa and much of Asia, while it's at an intermediate level in Latin America. Okay? So you can see, like, some countries that feature very different child penalties are very similar in terms of the fraction that these child penalties explain. So, for example, child penalties were modest in Scandinavia, but they explain virtually all of the gender inequality there. Child penalties are very large in Switzerland, and they also explain virtually all of the gender inequality there. Conversely, child penalties are extremely large in the Middle East, but they still only explain a modest fraction of gender inequality in the Middle East because the raw gender gap is proportionally larger. Okay. So this gives you a sense of just the variation in child penalties and in their relative importance. Okay, so now I want to move, try and dig a little bit deeper. The first thing I want to say a little bit about is the possibility of marriage penalties. So up until now, I've talked about the impacts of parenthood and childbirth without even mentioning a closely connected institution, namely the institution of marriage. This is particularly important at lower and middle income levels. So in low and middle income countries, very few children are born outside or before marriage. And at the same time, childbirth tends to follow very soon after marriage. So there is sort of the event of parenthood and the event of marriage are closely connected in time. So in other words, marriage essentially implies an anticipation of impending parenthood. Okay, that raises two questions that we think about in this project. The first one is, does marriage impose labor market penalties on women over and above those implied by parenthood in and of itself? And the second question is sort of more of an identification question, which is, does the fact that the marriage event and the childbirth event are relatively close in time and staggered in a certain way, does that impose a threat to the estimation of child penalties? I'm not going to go into the details with this estimation, but just sort of describe the bottom line of what we find and then sort of use that for some later analysis that I want to show you. The bottom line is that, yes, there are marriage penalties in addition to child penalties, especially in lower and middle income countries. Actually, the event of marriage itself has a large penalty on women in lower and middle income countries. In high-income countries, marriage penalties are virtually zero. That's the first point. And the second point is that there's enough variation in the gap between childbirth and marriage for us to be able to jointly estimate child penalties and marriage penalties in event study framework and show that our child penalty estimates that you've seen are robust to accounting for marriage effect. So the effects of marriage don't really bias the estimates of you've seen, but it's an additional effect that is part of the story when we're trying to explain gender inequality. In some sense, the impacts of marriage reinforce the idea that family formation is critical for understanding the variation in gender inequality across countries and over time. Okay, we introduced this notion in the paper that we call family penalties, which is the combined impact of marriage and parenthood. Okay, so with those this general summary of what we do with marriage penalties, let me move on and think about how child and marriage penalties evolve by level of development. So what we do here is that, well, the first step of what we do here is to decompose gender gaps at each level of GDP per capita into what can be attributed to the impact of children, what can be attributed to the impact of marriage, and a residual, which includes everything else that may explain child penalties. These would be things like education differences between men and women or discrimination. Okay. That decomposition looks like this. So here we look at the gender gap in employment by levels of log GDP per capita. This is the total gap here, and you have that inverse U that I showed you in the beginning, the sort of the Kuznets curve of gender inequality, if you will. The gray area is the residual gap that we can't attribute directly to marriage or parenthood, The light blue area is the marriage-related gap, and the dark blue area is the child-related gap. Okay, so what are the key insights here? Well, the first insight is that we have this inverse U, the Kuznets curve, that you've already seen. The two other key insights here is that over the course of development, there's this strong secular increase in the relative importance of child penalties. They go from explaining a very tiny fraction of gender inequality to explaining virtually all of gender inequality. So it increased secularly, and then it plateaus at high levels of GDP per capita until child penalties fall very slightly at the very highest income levels. The marriage-related gap is significant already at low development levels. They stay significant at intermediate levels, and then they become very small at the highest income levels. So children and marriage together, the impact of family formation, explains about 50% of gender inequality at low development levels. They explain 100% of gender inequality at high development levels. Or in fact, as you can see here, the residual gaps become slightly negative at the highest GDP levels. That means that if not for the impact of children and marriage, women would be ahead of men in high-income countries. Okay? Now, how should we think about this development process here? Well, one thing we present suggestive evidence on the paper is that is the role of structural transformation of labor markets over the course of development. So let me show you some correlations that I think are suggestive. So this graph here considers 4 specific dimensions of how labor markets change with development. Okay, we're looking at the fraction of the labor force working in agriculture, the fraction of the labor force working in industry, the fraction of the labor force working in salaried employment, and finally the fraction of the labor force living in urban areas. Okay, and so we're plotting the child penalty against these different proxies for structural transformation. As you can see, the relationships are strong. Child penalties are strongly declining in the importance of agriculture, increasing in the importance of industry, increasing in the fraction employees, and increasing in the degree of urbanization. We could do similar scatter plots considering the total family penalty instead of just the child penalty. Those results give essentially tell the same story, except that the gradients are slightly smaller because there's some offset between child penalties and marriage penalties over the course of development. So I think these patterns leads to sort of a development story that we tell in the paper. So essentially that we sort of how gender inequality and child penalties evolve over development goes like this. So at low levels of development, we have low incomes and high fertility. Work is mostly agricultural, rural, and self-employed. There's little separation between the family and the workplace. There are gender gaps. They're significant, but they're driven by factors that predate childbirth, such as education choices and marriage. Then as economies develop, the labor market transitions from agriculture to industry, from rural to urban, and from self-employment to salaried employment. And this creates this separation between the family and the workplace that leads to a specialization between childcare and market work. And this specialization is then highly gendered. And that really creates this invention of the stay-at-home mom, which you actually don't really have at early stages of development. And then at the highest levels of development, women close the education-related gap and they close the marriage-related gap. But child penalties are sticky and prevent full gender convergence. And at this late stage of development, gender inequality becomes virtually synonymous with child penalties, consistent with what we've shown in several papers over the last few years, focusing specifically on high-income countries. Okay. Now, the final step of our project is so this development story here is based on comparing countries cross-sectionally today, right? So looking at countries at different development levels today. The final thing we do in the paper is to try and validate this development story, looking at countries over time, specifically looking at today's high-income countries historically, and see if they evolved in a similar way. Okay, so that's the final piece that I want to show you. So, one of the advantages of the pseudo-event study approach is, well, first of all, it's an advantage of working on child penalties because there's such a robust and clear feature of the data that you can typically see them whatever you do. And then on top of that, an advantage of the pseudo-event study approach is that it's so powered up that it allows for doing compelling quasi-experimental studies of the impact of childbirth, even using historical data. So what we do for this component of the data is we use historical censuses for a set of current high-income countries. These data go back to the 1800s for some countries, the 1700s for other countries. And we do a similar analysis to the one you've seen based on event studies around childbirth. I'm going to focus on the US first and then show you something for other countries as well. So this graph here shows event studies of childbirth in the United States between 1880 and 2020 by decade. And you can see here how over time in the US, child penalties are initially very small, right? So in the late 1800s in the US, child penalties are 3 to 5%. They then increase steadily through the early part of the 20th century until they reach their peak around 1960, where child penalties in the US are around 47%. Then they start declining gradually until the 90s, after which they plateau at a level of about 20%, which is where the US is today. Okay, so that's sort of a within-country validation of this similar trajectory of child penalties that you see across countries at different levels of GDP per capita today, right? So the level of GDP per capita back here for the US is similar to the GDP per capita level of countries like Mongolia and Namibia today. Okay. Another way of seeing this is by plotting the time series of child penalties, which I do in this diagram here. Here I distinguish between scaled and unscaled child penalties. By unscaled child penalties, I mean effects on employment rates in percentage points, and by scaled child penalties, I mean effects on employment in percentages. The event studies back here are unscaled event studies, so we're looking at absolute impacts on employment. Okay, let's focus on that one first. You can see this relationship that you've seen through all the different event study plots. Child penalties are initially tiny, then increase until they reach almost 50% in 1960, and then they decline and eventually plateaus. We also show here that there is a sizable level difference between scaled and unscaled child penalties at early times in history, and that's because female labor force participation rates were extremely low in the late 1800s, so even small effects in absolute terms turn into fairly large effects in relative terms. So the qualitative pattern for scaled child penalties is about the same, but the level is quite a lot higher in early times, but not in recent times. Do we see similar things for other high-income countries going back historically? Yes, we do. Here show event studies for a bunch of different countries in early times and very early times. And as you can see here, child penalties were extremely small in the 1700s and 1800s. For the countries where we can go all the way back to sort of subsistence agriculture in the 1700s, in Denmark and Iceland, you have 0 child penalties in these places. Countries that we observe in the 1800s and early 1900s, you see child penalties, but they're really modest, similar to what we saw historically for the US. Finally, I should say that while we don't really see sizable child penalties historically in these countries, we do see sizable marriage penalties. So maybe let me just show you that in a diagram here. So this bar chart here shows marriage penalties in red and child penalties in blue, and the sum of the two is the total family penalty. As you can see, the blue area is small, as you have just seen, but there are sizable marriage penalties in all of these countries. So historically, marriage had a much bigger impact than parenthood per se, exactly as we see today for example, countries in Central Africa. Okay. So let me conclude where we are with this project and where we want to go in the future. So we've built this global atlas of child penalties covering 95% of the world population. As you've seen, there's lots of variation in child penalties. There's variation across development levels, and there is variation conditional on development. We also investigate marriage penalties. These are sizable at early and intermediate stages of development, but converges to zero at later stages. Overall, the focus on marriage penalties, together with child penalties, reinforce this idea that family formation is critical for understanding the evolution of gender inequality. So, besides descriptively showing the variation in child penalties and this sort of macro development stories about what happens to child penalties over time, one way that one can take this down the line is that now we have so much variation in child penalties across the entire globe. Besides what I've shown you here, we also document within-country variation in child penalties. And all of this data allows for richer analysis of mechanisms, and we can sort of start thinking about exactly what are the kinds of political institutions, cultural institutions, policies, and labor markets, and so on, that create large versus small child penalties. So that's one of the sort of future objectives of this. Finally, I want to advertise our website, the Atlas website. So along with this project, we've created this website, which is intended as a collaborative infrastructure for sharing, using, and disseminating child penalty data from around the world. I invite you to go and take a look at it. The web address is childpenaltyatlas.org. We're extremely open to hearing from people who have data or know how to get data from some of the countries that are not currently included in our atlas, such as countries in Northern Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. And of course also to people who have better data for countries already included than the data we're currently using. So don't hold back and get in touch with us about that. That's all I have for you. This is the project. I thank you for your attention and for the Richard Musgrave visiting professorship and the kind words before my talk. Thanks to all of you. Thank you.